Welcome to Green Disruptors, Scaling the Future, a podcast where we dive into the innovations transforming clean energy and the real business challenges of making sustainability scalable. From breakthrough technologies to the tough decisions behind growth, we explore what it takes to build a greener future at scale. I'm your host, Megan Kerr, and my mission is to help green tech companies tell stories that matter. This podcast is brought to you by Mountaintop Social Marketing. Hi, and welcome back to Green Disruptors. Today, we are talking about buildings as an extension of the grid, and I have Douglas Golden on with us, and I'm going to let him give us a background into who he is. And hey, Doug, how's it going?
Doing well, Megan. Hi. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody.
Thanks. Yes, we're very festive today on
today.
Green Disruptors.
That's right. Hi, Doug Golden. I have hit now officially 22 years in the energy business today.
Yes, it's your anniversary.
My anniversary, that's right. Yeah, I started my career 22 years ago today with Reliant Energy, and went on to spend almost 12 years with Reliant or its successor entities, NRG Energy, where I held a variety of roles there, leaving as managing director of their commercial origination team. After the acquisition of Reliant, NRG went on to either start or acquire other customer-facing brands, things like solar power partners and distributed generation or energy alternatives and reliability. We started EVgo, which is now a separately spun out traded company for EV services. And bringing all of those things together to customers in the commercial, industrial, and institutional spaces in one bundled offering was what we were doing there, and that's how NRG still goes today. Leaving there, I went to Metris Energy, a very small startup, but really the founder or really the first one to scale in the energy efficiency as a service space. Metris was born out of a solar financier owner that believed that there was the same way to buy energy efficiency through a off-balance sheet pay for performance type arrangement, similar to a PPA, except a savings PPA. And we went to market with that. I spent a few years with Metris before jumping over to the more construction side of the business in an EPC that was out of the Midwest doing lighting services, eco engineering. Moved eco from lighting into becoming an EPC in solar, EV charging, and backup generation. And then spent the last 2.5 years of my life with Spark Fund as their chief operating officer, and helping Spark Fund grow their EPC business and moving into what they're doing now in the distributed capacity procurement side.
Kind of weird to sum up 22 years of a career in 1 minute, but you did a great job.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. So I was excited to talk today because obviously there's all these big projects going on and really advanced scientific stuff that maybe a layperson wouldn't understand. But this topic to me, it was easy for me to grasp and easy to see how applicable it is no matter who you are or what you're doing day to day.
Sure. Utilities are facing an unprecedented challenge right now of 2 or in some instances 3xing their grid capacity to meet the needs of electrification of fleets or buildings or the onshoring of manufacturing. And the biggest consumer of all and what we hear about is generative AI and just data center usage, right? In many instances in utilities across the country today, their interconnection queues for data centers are larger than what their peak demands have been on their peak day in their either summer or winter, depending on what part of the country they're in. Their queue to interconnect load for data centers exceeds that. So there's this real
by kind of a lot, right?
By kind of a lot. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's this real need to actually, after 20 plus years, generational time period of flat load growth, we are seeing this unprecedented load growth. And I think the thing that's really surprised everybody is how quickly it got here and just how ubiquitous it is really across the country. It's not isolated to one area or another, right? It is every utility across the country is facing this problem today of how do I provide more megawatts on my system to attract more economic development in my territory. And I think it's, it's not the only way to solve it, but making the built environment of what already exists today, the existing distribution system, existing buildings, part of that equation through siting the distributed energy resources on them is one easy way, right? Solar, batteries, gensets, and making devices that are already existing in these buildings or will go in these buildings, things like heat pumps or hot water heaters or thermostats or electric vehicle charging stations, able to be controllable by the single point of grid operator, the utility, making them controllable and dispatchable in some instances, like a battery, is going to help solve that problem. We'll still have the need for building large power plants, whether it's renewable or fossil fired, off-site and building transmission infrastructure to bring those in and upgrading the grid. But to get megawatts out there fast, we need to use the existing infrastructure that's already there today, the existing built environment.
So, okay, tell me if I'm wrong here, but is there already the potential to generate that extra energy, but the problem is communication and connectivity between all of those?
So that's part of the problem today is there's no common standard for how those devices communicate with each other or how to send signals back and forth, right? That's one problem today. Another problem is the adoption of some of those technologies just hasn't gotten widespread enough, right? There's a lot of people who have EVs, but it's still, single digit percentage points in the population, right? And the number of people that have home chargers is even less than that, right? There's a lot of people that rely on public charging networks. So there just hasn't become this huge mass deployment of these things that can be controlled, right? The things that are out there need the functionality to be able to be controlled. And as we look at upgrading building systems, as new homes are built or homes are upgraded, right, using a heat pump instead of a conventional HVAC system and putting that in with the controls to be operated by a grid operator is key. Second piece of that.
Back up. How does that work? Like if I got a heat pump, yeah.
Yeah, it would be effectively giving the utility or some grid operator or somebody who's a participant into the market control or authority to control your thermostat. Or EV charging is probably the better example of that. As far as you set something that says, I'd like my vehicle to be at 80% charged by 7 in the morning when I leave for work. Mm-hmm. And then it's up to the grid operator to decide when to push electrons to that charger based on the other load that's in the system, right?
So they're not going to set your thermostat to 50 degrees because algorithmically that makes sense.
Well, they might, yeah. And so this is key where you have to give consumers the flexibility then to override that for their own comfort, right?
Okay.
But it's, there's hot water heaters is a great example of it, right? Where if you say, okay, I leave for work at 8 and I get home at 6, and I'd like my water to be a certain temperature by the time I get home at 6, giving them the flexibility to not have your hot water heater heating up on and off during the day every time the temperature drops, right? But making sure that when you do come home at 6, your water temperature is what you want it to be, right? I think that's, again, why EV charging is probably the easiest example of that to understand. As long as you have enough charge in your battery, from the time you park your car to the time you drive it again, letting somebody else, a third party, decide when to push power to it based on other conditions on the grid is what we're lacking today. The other piece of that is on the energy production and storage side, things like solar or generators or batteries, where the real ability to control those today doesn't really exist on a consolidated basis at a utility. Most utilities lack a great, what they're called DERMS platforms, distributed energy resource management systems. Mm-hmm. So a DERMS platform that is able to control all of those small assets that are out in the wild today, that control is largely, set by the owner of those systems. And so one of the other fundamental things that needs to shift here, Megan, is who owns those systems? Is it the homeowner? Is it the building owner? Or can those be utility-owned assets that get out into the wild that utility controls and just looks for people to host those assets for them whether it's a battery container in their parking lot or a solar array on their
Right.
roof, right? That the utility owns those and then has control over them today.
So what's the win-win scenario for a business owner who maybe decided to have like a backup battery system in their parking lot?
Yeah, so the win-win for that person could be a payment from the utility or from the owner, let's say, from the owner to because I think there will be private owners of these systems, virtual power plant folks that exist today and interface with utilities. So the owner of that system would pay the host some hosting fee for space, right? They would rent the parking spaces or they would rent the roof or whatever it might be to have these assets.
Or
And then,
you could have a mini solar farm on your roof and rent out that real estate.
correct, that's right. It's just more rentable space for folks. The other win from that could be that you are now making your piece of the grid, because the grid is just a big conglomeration of little pieces from substations down to distribution feeders and everything like that just snowballs to one large thing. You are now making your little piece of it more resilient. And so in times of grid outage or outages in other areas, you might be able to now be isolated. Your utility might be able to isolate your circuit and use the resources that exist in your area to keep you and your neighboring businesses and homes up and running. And so you could be buying yourself some resilience out of it. So income stream.
I was going to say that can't be bad
resilience.
for PR, no matter what way you're looking at it.
That's right. Yeah.
Being able to put yourself forward as a green forward type of a company. This is what we're doing for the community. Yeah. Seems kind of like a no-brainer.
It seems like it would be.
So what's the pushback?
Yeah, so the pushback is, the ownership of those assets today. There's lots of areas in the country where utilities can't own assets. If you look through the entire PJM interconnect, so that's broadly Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Ohio, parts of Illinois, utilities can't own generating assets. The transmission distribution system is separate from the people who own generation. It's a competitive generation market. The same here in Texas, where I live. The utilities, the T&D companies can't own generation, so CenterPoint, Encore can't own generation. So really the first place for this to take off is in those fully vertically integrated utilities that can value the marginal capacity, they can value the congestion that this relieves on their system, and they're not prohibited from owning the assets. And so you think of an Xcel Energy or a Southern company or folks like that who operate fully vertically integrated utilities are the first test basis for this. But the majority of the population, if you think of Texas and the PJM interconnect, that's a large swath of the population where the utilities can't own those resources today through some legislative actions.
Do you think we'd be better off if we were able to be able to make some updates in those laws?
I do. I think, batteries seems to be the gray area for folks because are they, in some instances, batteries are consuming power when they're recharging themselves. And in some instances, they're discharging power. And so they look like a generator. And so I think, there's going to be some interesting cases, I think, certainly to follow in the PJM market around batteries and ownership of batteries and how they're classified. So I think that's one big shift to watch. And then as folks just want to become more resilient, but they can enable private industry to do that. In Texas, there's the Texas Backup Power Program that's going to roll out later this year. It'll be a state-sponsored program, so it'll be state-funded, an incentive program for folks to build microgrid facilities on what they determine are critical care facilities. So think of retirement homes or dialysis clinics or gas stations right? And so there's going to be an incentive offered by the state for folks to build those assets on those, and that'll be privately controlled but state sponsored. And so there will be the PUC will mandate being able to work with the utilities on the dispatch and the control of those.
It does seem like more is able to get done at a state level, and when a state can take an initiative like that, that can be a pretty powerful move.
More can be done at the state level. The one thing that utilities also have is, the franchise on is, having the customer base and the charter to go and deliver, clean, reliable, safe electrons to their consumers and to really promote economic development in their territory, right? Utilities exist really for two reasons. One, to provide reliable electricity to folks, and second, to stimulate economic development in their areas, right? This country we created a tremendous amount of wealth on the backs of fossil fuels, and we should celebrate that. We created a tremendous amount of wealth on the backs of fossil fuels by providing folks reliable, cheap electricity to power, or energy broadly, right? In some instances, lots of gas, to power their businesses, to fuel their businesses, and create the economic engine that we have today. And utilities are a huge part of that, right?
Yeah. Well, I loved what you and I were talking about this earlier, that I think we need to take a moment to realize that we would not be where we're at as far as current technology and current problems and the ability to solve said problems were it not for the economy built on fossil fuels.
Yeah. And I think that's where some of the messaging gets lost in the political arena, not to get political. In the political arena, I think that's where some of the messaging gets lost, right? Oil and gas companies are not the enemy, right? They are the reason that we have gotten to where we have gotten today as a society, right? We need to celebrate the use of oil to get us, the first industrial revolution. We now just know there's a better way to do things.
Yeah.
And
people don't, they don't want to embrace change, and they don't want to change the way they've been making a lot of money. So I can understand why there's resistance, but they don't need to be the enemy or the bad guys. They can find a way. We can find a way to help them help us in the transition.
Yeah, and for so much of the last 20 years, those types of things, renewables, specifically solar and then batteries, have not been at cost parity with what the alternatives are.
Yeah.
But the cost of oil has stayed reasonably elevated. The cost of natural gas is certainly way up from its lows over the last 10 years. And so the price of those of solar modules and the associated infrastructure with solar and battery cells has come down as you've gotten broader adoption of it. And so now you're reaching parity. When you throw in, again, this is why, back to my point about who should own these, when you throw in the cost of upgrading your T&D infrastructure and the substations and transformers and everything like that comes with the need to deliver a lot more electrons on the grid, right? When a utility can take that entire cost and say, okay, their alternative would be to rate base all of these upgrades. And when they can say, we can accomplish the same thing by rate basing this battery in this parking lot at this building, and it's the same cost or less, they should be allowed to do that as a substitute for upgrading their legacy system.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, all those things get done, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, we still need large central station generation. Natural gas is still going to be a transitional fuel for most of the U.S. in that, right, to balance out the intermittency of renewables and to make up for, batteries that aren't as widely deployed, right? And so we still do need large-scale generation off-site, and we need to build the associated infrastructure to bring that in. But distributed resources, where I've spent really the last 15 years of my career, are really key to helping bridge, where we are today and the speed at where we have to get to.
What do you what do you plan on working on next, and what's kind of it's like what's exciting and what's challenging? Maybe they're the same thing, but where are you at with that?
Yeah, so I think what's exciting for me is just how this industry has evolved over the last 22 years. 22 years ago, it was a very boring industry where I took a job, right? Today I think if I was looking at it, I would make a conscious career choice. I've made a conscious career choice to stay in this industry, right? 22 years ago, it wasn't that. It was where did I get a job first? And I tell people, I was in energy industry by chance 22 years ago, and I'm energy industry by choice today.
By choice now.
Yeah. The speed of evolution of where things are going is staggering, both in terms of what is needed to keep up and the evolution. I remember when we were developing solar projects, 12 or 15 years ago, and the big breakthrough in solar modules was the SunPower 240 watt module, and people, we used to talk how much can we actually squeeze out of one of these things, right? And today there's modules that you can buy on the market today that are 700 watt plus, and
wow,
we thought the move from 200 to 240 was game changing. And sure,
it's
the modules
more than
have gotten
triple that.
larger over time. They're larger format than they were, and so, but on a per square meter basis, they're still at least twice what they were back then on for the same size footprint. And so the efficiency factor is just getting greater in those, and that's why I've gravitated more towards solar than wind in my career. And solar is like everything else. As as the technology advances, it gets smaller. Where wind, if you want more output out of a wind turbine, you just build it bigger, right? You just have a giant wind turbine, and that's how you get more out of it. And so solar is kind of a shrinking thing. Batteries will be the same thing. Your power density is going to, as that grows, the efficiency of the materials grow. You're going to be able to shrink the footprint of a battery.
Shrink the batteries.
That's right. And so solar and battery together are just really interesting.
Kind of a limitless potential.
Sort of, yeah, sort of, right? I mean, you're always going to be limited by, one of the factors today that's really limiting deployment of it is, whether it's credit score of a homeowner or of a business, right?
Yeah.
To be able to accept that, and the financial wherewithal to be able to pay for that. If you can't pay for it all up front, you have to finance it over a long period of time. And today it's you're judged on your credit and your ability to pay that. In some markets like California, you can use PACE, which ties it to your property taxes for the repayment of it. And so it really looks at it stays with the house regardless who the owner is, and you can place liens and stuff like that. But most of the country, really has to rely on either funding out of pocket or being creditworthy enough to be able to borrow over some 20-year period of time.
I mean, and that's still really hard because, we have solar panels on our house because the guy we bought the house from was extremely energy conscious, and we've got hookups for electric. But if that was us forking over our money as a younger family, I care so much, and it's just still so hard to do.
Sure, it's hard to make that justification, right? Think about if you're a business, it's really hard to make that justification. If it's anything, businesses really, they need to be investing their money in what their core operations are. And there's very few businesses out there whose core operations are generating electricity for their own consumption, right? And so the investments need to go to what's going to continue to, increase their revenues, increase their profitability, and things like, energy efficiency or renewable energy generation just get lost in that shuffle. Again, why?
So is the solution to that more like government subsidies and perks, or is it just swiftly getting to the point where it is more affordable?
Yeah, I think it's really it's changing who the buyer is, right? Making the utilities the buyer of these things unlocks a tremendous amount of utilities have, I wouldn't say an endless supply, but near endless supply of capital at really affordable rates, right? There's no shortage of large funds that will invest in utilities, be it pension funds or things like that invest in utilities because of their, very creditworthy rated entities, and they're chartered really by the state as state regulated monopolies to return a constant rate of return to their shareholders. The utilities can access a lot of capital. There's private entities that can sort of do the same thing, a little bit more expensive capital, but can go out and actually attract a tremendous amount of capital to deploy in this. And so I think part of it is it's the ownership of those assets. It's really changing who the owner of those assets is, creating a new what I call a new wholesale buyer of these things, right? Which then my last two businesses running EPC businesses, one of the things that really will get you is the utilization rate of your crews, right? The project based work, it's like trying to build a parking lot for Black Friday, right? Like you would never build a parking lot for Black Friday.
It's a good analogy.
You would never build the size of your crew for the peak business time of the year. And so but you do have this flex in your crew where you don't have enough work to keep your crews busy. And sometimes you have too much work and you need to supplement by bringing in either subcontractors or outside help. And that's because everything is dependent upon a sales group going out and making one-off sales, right? It's going to people or businesses and trying to convince them to buy a thing from you. And, to our point of how we started this piece of the thread of there's only so many people that can or want to make that purchasing decision. And so if you create a new class of buyer in this, where it's a utility or some large institution that's going to, VPP or something like that, or a co-op or a municipality in the instances, right? There was a great press release a week or so ago from Base Power. They're based here in Texas, and Bandera Electric, which is a co-op out in Central Texas, where they're providing incentives for folks to put batteries at their houses to be able to use to help keep reliability on their grid, right? Excel and Spark Fund have been making lots of announcements about doing the same thing up in the Minnesota territory, and Excel in their most recent rate case settlement, got approval for multi hundreds of megawatts of distributed capacity throughout their system, right? So this is starting to happen where co-ops or utilities are starting to be these wholesale buyers. What that does then is you can go to the contractors in those areas and say, okay, here's what our projections look like for the year. This is how much you're going to do. And you can have a constant staffing level. And, sure, weather will get in the way in lots of instances, right? But, taking weather fluctuations out of it, you can staff to that. Your cost per person can come down because you're not having to, cost in underutilization rates. And so you can bring the cost of labor down. When you start buying things in big quantities, you can bring the cost of the materials down, right? So you can start to really bring the costs of these things down as well over time with a new classification.
So if those utility companies are acting as the wholesaler, like, would that mean like a homeowner or a business owner could go to them and just get a way better rate than they would have if they tried to, like, am I understanding that correctly?
Sort of, yes, sort of no, right? In the instance of, I don't know the full details on what Base Power and Bandera, I only know what I read in the press, but that looks like a situation where they're going to homeowners and giving them a significant discount on a battery for their home, for the ability for the co-op to call on that battery when they need it.
Right. Yeah. That makes
the
sense.
Excel program with Spark Fund, will be putting assets out there that are owned by the utility and controlled by the utility on a customer site. And so it's, kind of back to that first. Now the customer has made their little piece of the piece of their puzzle more resilient and should get benefits out of it that way. But those assets are placed out there by the utility and should be done so at a cost that's cheaper than building all the infrastructure needed to get the same amount of megawatts from other sources.
From like a whole new
right, and so it should lower the cost to all Excel customers in their territory.
Okay, very cool. So, all right, we've covered a lot. This has been very. I feel like maybe I'm swimming a little more than usual trying to wrap my head. I mean, there's so many different moving pieces and so many different ways that you could do this. So do you have like a summary maybe of kind of, I don't know, I'm failing on this question. What do you want to add as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I think one of the things to understand is the innovation that needs to take place in this space has largely already happened. We have the technologies exist today to solve probably greater than 95% of the problem that we're facing. And so it's not about folks going out and creating a new shiny object or a new black box thing that you plug into your wall, right? These already exist.
The science is there already.
Science is there already, right? Yeah. It's now about adoption, and the barriers to adoption have been, a lot of it is funding. It's not people not wanting to pay for it. The assets not getting valued properly because there's no control over them today. And so, it's hard for a utility to value that asset on their grid if they're not going to be able to control it. And so, solving that, the value of those assets, which then helps bring the cost of them down if they can extract value.
Because if they can demonstrate that to investors,
that's right. But what the industry doesn't need is some new toy, right? That plugs into your house and makes it better. The technology exists today. Let's solve the adoption problem. That's my summary.
Yeah. Well, and this is what I've learned just from the conversations that I've already had with other leaders. It's like it's usually a business bottleneck problem or a policy problem. Like it's not the science. So in a way, I find that comforting because like these are challenges that humanity has faced, and as organizations, we can make steps to figure it out. But anyway, thank you so much for coming on today, and I appreciate you teaching me. If there's anybody who's wanting to make a green investment right now, it sounds like going for these, small scale grid adoptions of these battery storage would be a good way to go.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Megan. It's been a pleasure to be on with you.
Okay. Well, keep us in tune with what's next for you. And thanks again so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Green Disruptors, Scaling the Future. Thanks to Doug for sharing his incredible insights on how buildings and distributed energy resources can become a powerful extension of the grid, and why the real challenge now is adoption, not innovation. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow, rate, and review us wherever you listen. Your support helps us bring more conversations like this to the forefront of clean energy. And if you know someone who'd benefit from learning how distributed energy can reshape the grid, share this episode with them. Be sure to stay tuned to more episodes where we dive deeper into the cutting-edge innovations and business strategies driving the clean energy revolution. Until next time, I'm Megan Kerr, helping green tech companies tell stories that matter. Let's keep scaling the future together.